Hey folks, my name is John Lee, and welcome back to the Korean 4-Day YouTube channel. Now, one of the first videos that I made for this channel was to talk about ramen noodles, specifically about tapaguri from the movie Parasite. Well, today, I'm back with more ramen content. What can I say? I'm Korean and I love the stuff. But today I want to focus a bit more on the history of ramyeon and how it became so popular in South Korea today. Ramyeon is serious business in South Korea. There are over 200 domestic brands, and in 2018, Koreans spent roughly about 2.5 trillion won, or about 2.1 billion American dollars on ramen alone. Now, it is also estimated that Koreans eat about 74 packs of ramen per year, making Koreans one of the highest consumers of ramen in the world. Sodium schmodium. But this year, due to the pandemic, ramen sales shot up through the roof, breaking record sales as more and more people choose to eat at home rather than go out to eat at restaurants. In fact, ramen is such a big part of our everyday lives that the phrase, "want to come over to my place for a bowl of ramen," is our version of "wanna Netflix and chill." But that's now. How did ramen become so popular? In order to find out, we need to travel back in time to when South Korea was unrecognizable to many people in the present day. Back in the middle of the 20th century, when South Korea was first founded, things looked pretty bleak. Korea had just gone through decades of Japanese occupation and a bloody civil war. At the time, South Korea was one of the poorest countries in the world. In fact, to put things in perspective, at the time, North Korea was actually richer than South Korea. It was right around the time when South Korea was slowly starting to rebuild itself from the war that Ramyeon, the very first ramen that was introduced in Korea, entered the markets. Now, when ramen first hit the markets, it wasn't exactly love at first sight. Koreans weren't quite sure what to make of it because it was the first time they'd seen anything like it. But that year, in 1963, something else happened that would eventually help to improve ramen sales. And that thing that happened was that South Korea's strongman and dictator, Chung-hee, officially became South Korea's president. Now, before I continue talking about ramyeon, I'm gonna need to go on a tangent for just a moment and talk a little bit about Park Chung-hee. For good or for ill, Park Chung-hee is an integral part of South Korean history. And so eventually, I'm gonna have to talk about him. Not talking about Park Chung-hee would be like trying to talk about Tesla without mentioning Elon Musk. That's just not gonna happen. But that being said, Park Chung-hee is not exactly a simple or pleasant topic to talk about. So he's going to have to be on a future episode or a future series of episodes. So for now, let's get back to the topic. When Park Chung-hee became president, South Korea was still struggling and limping from the effects of the Korean War. In fact, South Korea at the time was still struggling to feed its own people. And so, one of the first things that Park Chung-hee did as president was to start the flour-based food promotional campaign. As South Korea was still struggling to feed its own people at the time, the government's plan was to introduce more flour-based food to people's dietary habits. In fact, the South Korean government at the time promoted flour-based food as being healthier and more nutritious than rice. Now, I don't know if it was deliberate or if it was a coincidence, but when ramen first entered the markets, it was marketed as the second rice. Now, as I said earlier, it wasn't an overnight sensation. Even with the government's promotion of flour-based food, people weren't quite sure what to make of it. So, the question is, how and why did Koreans start to eat more ramyeon? Well, the answer is because of the government's other concurrent policies that were going on at the same time. The South Korean government was going through an industrialization process at the time. Textiles, steel, aluminum, petrochemicals, you name it, the South Korean government wanted a piece of it. And in order to go through industrialization, they needed workers. And because they needed workers, there was a demographic shift in South Korea. People were moving from the countryside to the cities. People would stop working in farms and they started working in factories. People were moving away from families to live alone. Women began to enter the workforce much more meaningfully. And because of this demographic shift, people weren't cooking at home as much as they used to. And so, people started to eat more ramyeon. So from 1963 to 1965, Samyang Ramen was the only ramen company in Korea. But in 1965, a new company emerged to challenge Samyang Ramen's monopoly, and that company was called Lotte Ramyeon. Now, Lotte Ramyeon still exists, but it hasn't been called that since 1975. Today, it is much more popularly known as Nongshim. Nowadays, due to the Fire Noodles challenge that everyone with a reaction channel on YouTube seems to have done, people know that South Korean ramen is spicy. But that wasn't always the case. There was a time when South Korean ramen wasn't spicy at all. That's because South Korea did not invent ramen noodles. Ramen noodles were invented by a Japanese company called Nissin Foods in 1958, a full 5 years before Samyang ramen entered the markets in Korea. And the very first brand that Nissin Foods introduced in Japan was called chicken ramen. So when Samyang ramen first began to be manufactured in 1963, it was heavily influenced by Nissin Foods chicken ramen, and Korean ramen was not spicy. But that all changed when Nongshim came up with Shinramyeon in 1986. By the way, Shinramyeon translates as spicy ramyeon. Now, it's been 34 years since Shinramyeon first appeared, and in that time, hundreds of different brands of ramyeon have come and gone. But Shinramyeon is still South Korea's #1 best-selling ramyeon to this very day. In 2016, Nongshim reported that since it started selling Shinramyeon, it has sold a total of 28 billion packets of Shinramyeon, which translates to about 10 trillion won, or 8.1 billion American dollars. Although South Koreans' relationship with ramyeon was not exactly love at first sight, once it started, we never looked back. Sure, health experts keep telling us to reduce our consumption of ramyeon, but there doesn't seem to be any end in sight to our appetite for the stuff. Okay, that about wraps it up. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click on the like, subscribe, and the notification bell. And if you have an opinion about what you just saw, don't keep it to yourself. Leave it down in the comment section. My name is John Lee, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.